Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us as we jump into another episode of Transforming Social Justice. This month, we're going to be talking about religious imperialism. And again, I have Justinne, one of our change makers from the team, on the call with us. Justinne, can you define religious imperialism for the audience before we jump into talking about some things?
Yes, so here at A Squared, we define religious imperialism as prejudice or stereotyping based on someone's religious beliefs, and this often leads to marginalization of diverse faiths and spiritual practices. So, Megan, I want to start this conversation by understanding how has religious imperialism shaped and influenced the education systems in the US?
This is a really interesting question, Justinne, because initially we talk about the separation of church and state, right? We say that we cannot talk about religion in schools. However, the Pledge of Allegiance, which is something that is spoken in many schools, actually at the start of the day, most times, says one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So even though we say separation of church and state, we have a pledge that we teach our children at a very young age. And oftentimes we teach our children out of rote memorization. It's not dissected to help them understand what they're actually saying. It's just started. And we teach our children to just recite this without really understanding what it means. But it is something that is shared. Now, some teachers will simply say, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. They'll skip that part altogether. However, if parents or older generations are hearing children say the pledge and they forget that part or they omit that part, many people are saying, what? That's not the whole pledge. And another piece with all of this is when we look at what has been selected for textbooks or what publishers have included in our textbooks and in our resources, it's often rooted in Christian belief systems. And it's really interesting to me, having been in the education system and really looking at that closely, how much is embedded where people don't even realize what it is that they're sharing or saying. When you're reading books or when you're reading a textbook and you see a picture of a Christmas tree in the background, but you don't see any other paraphernalia, you don't see any other religions represented, those are all things that, whether unconscious or consciously, are being brought into our school systems. But I think the number one piece is some of the language, how we do the national anthem and the Pledge of Allegiance, and how we do that without really thinking about what it means, yet still saying that there's separation of church and state. And really, what that separation of church and state needs to do is to really look at all of the policies and say, we don't want to encourage one religion over another. Instead, we're going to teach and educate about all of the different facets of religion. And oftentimes, our children don't get that exposure.
Yeah, I'd say where I grew up in the Philippines is also kind of the same. Our laws, policies, our education, just culturally very deeply Catholic. And as you know, Philippines has the longest Christmas. Like a third of our year is Christmas.
We've
So
talked about that. Yeah.
yeah, our Catholicism and Christianity is very deeply ingrained into Filipino daily life, and I can imagine how difficult it must be for non-Catholics. Like there's a specific region in the Philippines that is Islam, that it's called Mindanao, like the lower region of the Philippines, and I think they want to be an autonomous state and separate from the Philippines for that specific reason, I believe.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I don't think we've talked about that before, but I think that is, you know, it speaks to why we need to have exposure to everything, because if they're feeling isolated and they want to be their own separate area because of that isolation, then
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot to be said around how can we have these conversations to include everyone in those conversations and to ensure that everyone is seen, heard, welcomed, and valued.
Yeah, that's true. And a peer research survey found that over 40% of public high school students regularly witness prayer on school grounds, indicating that an ongoing presence of religious expression in public education. So, in what ways does religious influence impact curriculum, and how might it limit students' exposure to diverse perspectives? And I'm also interested to know what subjects are most affected by this influence.
Yeah, we started to talk about this a little bit, but what's really interesting to me is when we talk about separation of church and state, it's about not enforcing or encouraging students to practice one religion over another. However, we there's nothing saying that we can't teach about the different aspects of religion or give an overview. And oftentimes, unless students are taking a religion course, they're not learning about all of the different religions that exist. I know myself, I didn't really dive into understanding different religions until after. I think there was one course in college, but I didn't really start to dive in until after college, and I did the research myself. And I went to school for education. So our teachers don't know a lot about other religious experiences or other religious doctrine unless they do the research themselves, because it's not in our teacher ed program. And in high school specifically, it's not talked about. I think people are almost afraid to talk about it because they're afraid they'll get in trouble. But what they're not realizing is that every day they're probably talking about something that has a Christian influence, right? There's so many historical movements that are rooted in Christianity and how that pilgrimage started. Just the idea of why people came to the US was to avoid religious persecution. There's so many things rooted, especially in history, around religion. And we don't talk about that too much. And I think a lot of it is because our educators are afraid of getting in trouble for talking about religion. And again, as an administrator, when I would talk to my teachers, I would always say, don't tell students that they need to or should be a certain religion or practice a certain religion. But talking about different religions, why Hanukkah is what it is, what does that look like? Why does Rosh Hashanah get celebrated the way it does? What is Diwali? What is Eid? Talking about what these different religious observances are and why they are put in place and why certain people tend to follow certain religious beliefs. That is something that I think all of our school systems can do a much better job of. Again, not telling students what to practice or what not to practice, but helping them understand why certain religions believe certain things. And when we're not talking about that, it impacts our curriculum because it takes things away from our students to be able to have different perspectives of. By not helping our students understand different perspectives early on, potentially using religion as an opportunity for that, we're not enhancing their ability to have that diversity of thought. But when you talk about subjects, a lot of it is rooted in history and then also in our literature and language arts courses. Now, science is another one. You have, do you believe in science? Do you believe in it's the whole, evolution versus creationism? So, are you believing in evolution or do you believe in creationism? And I think that is something as well, right? If we're talking about evolution, then that means that we all came through the primate family. If we're talking about creationism, we're talking about Adam and Eve. But I think those are conversations that oftentimes when we get into biology, when we get into life science, teachers are struggling because they're like, what do I teach? Do I talk about how we are all connected at some point because of DNA? Or do we talk about how different people have, there's just a lot of pieces there. So science, history, language arts, all of that can really be impacted if we just open up the conversation. Again, not to say you need to be Christian or you need to be Buddhist, but to say here are different examples of different religions and why they observe what they observe and how that impacts them as people. You know, when we're talking about that, Justin, I'm wondering, what do you think is a way that we can identify or challenge when we do see religious imperialism in our schools? So, when a teacher goes one step further and says, and this is why all of us need to celebrate Christmas, or, and this is why all of us need to believe in evolution, how does that kind of tie in, or how can people challenge religious imperialism in schools?
Yeah, I think first things first, of course, to identify and challenge religious imperialism, educators and administrators. must critically examine policies, curriculum, the practices in schools that may like prioritize or normalize one faith while marginalizing other faiths. And this includes, like you mentioned, reviewing holiday celebrations, prayer practices in schools, dress codes, the teaching materials to ensure that they're inclusive of diverse religious and non-religious perspectives. Uh, so how does religious imperialism play in shaping these policies and practices, especially in public schools, in the school systems?
Yeah, I mean, similar to what you just said, examining those policies, but taking a step back and saying, does this policy favor one group over another? So, when we're looking at educational policies, for example, when do you take breaks? A lot of schools are starting to take observance holidays for different religions. But it's important to not just take those days off, but to tell your students, talk to your students about why you're taking those days off. Also, looking at policies and practices as far as what is the policy when either a student or a staff member needs to take a day off? Are they able to take days off for holidays and religious observances? A lot of times, our school districts have policies in place that you cannot take a day before or after a longer holiday. So, for example, if there is the winter break and someone wants to take, there are times where people are expected to go into school right after that or right before that. And sometimes you might have holidays that interfere with that. So, do you have policies in place that say, we prefer that you don't take a day before or after a break, but also acknowledging that there might be times where you do need to? And I'm trying to think of the exact example, but there have been times in our past where we've had clients call us and say, how do we handle this? But there's been a longer break for something. You know what? I think it might be in the spring. There's often a spring break that typically falls around the Christian holiday of Easter, but there's also Orthodox Easter that falls on a different date. And I think that's what it was, is that someone wanted to take a day after their spring break because of their Orthodox Easter. And the school district said, but you can't take a day before or after a longer break in the school system. And that is a policy that is definitively religious imperialism based. It's saying this is what we give you, this is the Christian holiday, and you need to be more expansive to bring in other holidays and other observances. So that is something really careful to look at, especially with your policies, is try not to have any absolutes. You will never be able to take a day before or after a break. You will never be able to take time in the middle of your day to pray. You don't want to have any absolutes. You need to be able to provide the opportunity and then simply ask people, instead of letting them come to you when they're having a problem and they need to request something, when you're onboarding someone, when you're talking about something, is there anything that we need to be aware of? And again, HR violation, you can't say what religion do you acknowledge or do you observe, but you can say, are there any holidays or are there any days or things that we need to be aware of to be able to accommodate who you are as a person to allow you to be your authentic self. That is something that you can do. You can also put right in your policy that we honor and acknowledge all religious doctrine as yours, and you are authentically yourself because of that. And just ask people to come forth and say, if you need any accommodations that we are not offering for the entire public of our school, please just come to us. Putting that in your policy to have that, if you need any accommodations or if there's anything you need to be able to honor your religious beliefs, please come talk to us, rather than just waiting for people to come talk to you. I think that's really, really important. The other question I have for you, because I know we've talked about some of this, Justin, is how do people, in your opinion, people from different religious backgrounds kind of navigate other environments where they acknowledge that one faith is favored over another? So if you're walking into a situation, you can tell that everyone around you acknowledges one faith or one religion, and you don't necessarily. How do you think students navigate that?
So students from different religious backgrounds, they often face religious imperialism and its challenges, like feelings of exclusion, alienation, or sometimes even a pressure to conform. I remember when I was in university here in the Philippines, I also went to a Catholic university, and I had one classmate. I don't believe he was very deeply religious, but he grew up Muslim in Mindanao, this region that I mentioned earlier. He grew up there, and all his family grew up there. So, and he recently just moved to our region right before we started university. So he had difficulty adjusting to the culture, the language, how we interacted, especially that the university that we were enrolled in is a Catholic university. Everyone was required to attend mass, and uh, like you had to attend mass because it's part, for example, the mass impacts subject that you were supposed to go in, so that professor would mark you as absent if you didn't go to the mass. So it's like a required attendance. So that's one thing that he talked about, that he didn't understand why he had to go to mass if he didn't necessarily believe in that, or it wasn't something that he practiced. It was a common experience for other religious denominations as well in my experience as a student. So definitely not personally, but I've seen other students experience that exclusion and alienation, and like I mentioned, even to a certain extent, a pressure to conform to some of the practices. And other things are like biases in policies, such as dress codes that restrict religious attires, or um, curriculum that center a dominant religion. And to navigate these challenges, some students find community from peers, family, or finding cultural organizations, or some feel a need to self-censor or adapt to the practices to fit the prevailing norms. So uh, I'm curious to know as well, how does exposure to religious imperialism in education affect student self-identity and their perception of cultural diversity?
Yeah, Justin, the story you shared is of someone who's older, right? College age.
Yeah.
If you go younger and you have students who don't see their religious observances or their belief system represented, that can be damaging. And what's even more damaging is if they see another religion or another cultural belief celebrated so much more, right? Because it starts to, especially in those younger years, up until the age of 12, you start to form all those initial synapses. So if a student doesn't see their own beliefs, they start to think that what they're seeing is right and what they practice is wrong. So it can really have some internalized oppression, some self negative talk that comes in around that when all you see is one culture represented or one dominant observance or holiday shared. And sometimes it's one or two, right? I think we went through a period in our schools that it was mostly Christian. We had Christmas concerts, we had Christmas break. When I went to school, that's all it was, right? Then you started to see a little bit more when people were talking about Hanukkah and they were doing the dreidel song at holiday concerts, right? And it was still Christmas concerts, but it had a little splash of the dreidel song. And now I think schools are starting to transition and they're going into winter break and winter concerts, but a lot of schools are still saying holiday. And there's not all religious observances that have a holiday this time of year. And I think that's important as well. And you have certain religions that don't celebrate any holidays because they believe that there is no reason to celebrate any of those things, that it is something that is, you have to be humble. You don't celebrate birthdays, you don't celebrate holidays, you have to have that humility and you don't celebrate, right? There's other religions that have different ways of celebrating. So when we have that exposure and it's limited exposure specifically, it can really impact students' self identity of if they do celebrate that. Oh, I'm right. I'm part of the dominant culture. And if they don't celebrate it, well, what's wrong with my family that we don't celebrate this? Right. So it can absolutely impact student self identity, especially before the age of 12. And then after the age of 12, it can almost become an anger of sorts of, well, why isn't anyone else talking about what I do? Right. Or I'm going to go against the system. It can still negatively impact, but that age of 12, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, like we've talked about, is really that pivotal year of initial synapses and those first thoughts that can ultimately lean into our core beliefs.
Yeah, and I remember as well, like I mentioned, I grew up going to religious institutions all throughout, from preschool all throughout university. And a part of that with my self-identity, which I have talked about a few times on the podcast and other content for a squared as well, is that I discovered with myself that I was queer early on. So that part of my identity intersected with how I grew up as Catholic and how I grew up being taught that that is against the Bible and that is not what God intended for me to be. That to a certain extent, I think I remember hearing from an educator that I'm going to hell for it, which stuck with me for a while. I have I think, very deeply internalized growing up, and uh, how I was taught and where I grew up really impacted how I grew up and how I identified with myself and how long it took me to accept my personal identity. And with the cultural diversity piece as well, like the story I told earlier, if really not for the internet, I didn't see other cultures or learn other things just because of the environment that I grew up in. So, and if anything, if I learned anything uh, culturally in school, sometimes it comes off as negative the way it is taught. So, I also want to ask you, what challenges do educators face when attempting to integrate diverse religious perspectives into the curriculum without reinforcing religious imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, really the biggest one here, like we discussed already slightly, is that separation of church and state. And I think a lot of staff members are afraid to say something that could get them in quote unquote trouble, right? And I think the big thing to remember is as long as you're not encouraging someone to practice a specific religion, teaching them about different aspects of religion is what we are supposed to be doing in our schools, is teaching about people, teaching about different belief systems, encouraging students to come up with their own belief systems. But there is a fear there, and I think that's the biggest challenge for educators is the fear of what people will say. And if you talk about the different religious beliefs, some people might perceive that as you're trying to persuade a child to be a specific religion. And I think it's about communication ahead of time of we are going to be discussing this because, and this is how we're going to approach it. That's what we can really do to kind of lay the groundwork so that everyone knows what's being discussed. So it's not a child comes home and says, guess what we learned about today, right? Allowing the parents an opportunity, allowing the families an opportunity to see what is going to be taught, not necessarily the lesson plan, but to give them an idea of what we're doing and why we're doing it. Too often in schools, we don't share the why, and it's important to share the why. Not just we're going to be talking about different religions today, but we're going to be talking about different religions so that students understand that there are multiple religions out there and that the diversity of our school and our community is rooted in multiple different religious perspectives or identities, etc. But I think that's the number one challenge. And what's really interesting is you have people on all sides of the fence. You have some people who say, yes, we need to teach about it, and some who say, no, we definitely should not teach about it. And the only way to assure that it is being taught, at least of one perspective, is to go to a private school that is rooted in that religious observance. So in this area, we have quite a few Jewish schools. So I'm sure they talk about Judaism and about the Torah, right? And we have some Catholic schools, and there is required mass at those Catholic schools. You know, we have different schools that if it is a private school, then they can require that. But in public schools, they're not supposed to require any of that.
So, with that in mind, how can teachers navigate teaching about religion in a way that respects both secular principles and the diverse beliefs of their students?
I think the number one thing is to really have a kind of a list, a document that has all of the different kind of either holidays, because that's something that students can grasp onto, or belief systems, or at least teaching about the main 3 to 5, right? You know, I think we share what Christianity is, we share about the evolution of Christianity just in our history, right? Talking about Judaism, we do to an extent when students are talking about the Holocaust, but they don't talk about the religious aspects of being Jewish, right? They talk about how someone might be Jewish, and sometimes some of the books, right? Like Lois Lowry's Number of the Stars, they talk a little bit about it. There's certain books that students are reading in schools that might give some perspective, but I think it's important for teachers to say, okay, how are we going to do this throughout the year? Not just for holidays, not just a surface level, but how can we share different components? And also in the beginning of the year, asking your students, what are some of your favorite traditions? Don't say religious holidays. What are some of your favorite traditions? And allowing traditions to be the root of the conversation instead of holidays or religious observances, your favorite traditions. And then you incorporate those as you're teaching throughout the year, but do that at the beginning of the year and then create your full plan. You know, teachers will often do lesson plans. Myself, I usually did them a week at a time. But I remember on my desk, mind you, this was 25 years ago, but I remember on my desk, I had the big desk calendar. And the desk calendar had the big, like the squares about this size for each day. And what I would do at the beginning of the year is I put every student's birthday. I put if the student had any allergies. This was before we asked about nut allergies, but I asked students about allergies because I had food allergies, right? So I asked students about allergies. I asked students what their favorite things were, because when they walked into the classroom on their birthday, they had their desk decorated with their favorite color, their favorite treat, whatever, right? Every student knew in my classroom that's what they would have. But I say all of this to say that I had my first Jehovah Witness student my 3rd year of teaching. And I remember I didn't know that they were Jehovah Witness. They had one of the first birthdays of the year, so it was in early September. I decorated their desk. We came in, and they were like, and they came up to me and they said, Miss Fucciarelli, I can't sit there. And I said, but happy birthday. He's like, we don't celebrate birthdays. And it was at that moment that I had to take a step back and say, I didn't even know that, because I didn't know anything about it, right? And I hadn't been taught all of these years up to this point. And I didn't even know we had any students who celebrated anything other than Christianity in our building. And I was asking questions, but I didn't know, right? So to think about all of those pieces, it's just how they observe, right? It's differences in how you observe. But I say all of that to say that teachers can know about their students, and then on that big desk calendar, write in when students say, what are your favorite traditions? If a student says something about, I love when we do this for Diwali, or I love when we do this for Eid, or I love, then put it in your calendar and bring that up for conversation. Don't ever ask your student to be the teacher, right? Unless your student says, I'd like to. But that's one of the biggest mistakes we make as teachers is, oh, well, it's your culture, so you'll be the best teacher for it. That student might not want to be the teacher for the class, right? But teachers can balance that out with, we're not saying that something is right or wrong. We're honoring students for their traditional, authentic beliefs, traditions, etc. And we're not asking about religion. We're saying, what's your favorite tradition, right? I know for us, a lot of our traditions are rooted around the holidays. So if someone asked me, what are your favorite traditions? I would tell them, and they would be able to infer what religion I practice because of that. But if someone just asked me about traditions, then it's open for interpretation. But I think that's one way that staff and teachers can bring in conversations without it impeding upon the separation of church and state.
So, how can they advocate for curriculum changes that reflect a more inclusive approach to religion? And the other side of it is, what challenges will or might they encounter in the process of advocating for it?
In this country, we have only had presidents who honor Christianity or Catholicism. And Catholicism is actually a branch of Christianity as well. So you've only had our leaders be Christian, or at least say that they are Christian, right? So you have a large society who do not necessarily believe that other religions should be brought in. And I think that's what the biggest kind of challenge will be, is to get society to acknowledge and recognize that it's important for our children to learn about multiple religious beliefs and traditions and doctrine. And when I say doctrine, it's not to indoctrinate anyone, but to share what is being said, what is being practiced, etc. And again, I think it's about that communication piece, but the challenges are going to be society pushback. The challenges are not staff members saying, I don't want to teach about this. If you give them the tools and they understand the why, I believe, at least from my experience in talking to staff, that if they know how to do it and they're given resources and tools to do it, they're willing to do whatever they can to make sure that every child is seen, heard, welcomed, and valued. The biggest pushback is going to be the community saying, we don't want you indoctrinating our students. So it's the communication of what exactly are you doing? What's the purpose for it? And helping them understand that it's not to convert anyone. It's simply to give them different perspectives so that they learn more about one another. But I think that's definitely going to be the biggest challenge.
So, how do we draw the line between religious imperialism and acknowledging like the cultural heritage of religions and religious traditions in a respectful and inclusive way?
It really comes down to curiosity, right? If you are experiencing or you meet someone who is honoring a different holiday than yourself, ask questions. You know, when you're getting ready to go into a meeting, like right now we're in December, right? And in December, instead of saying, what are you doing for Christmas? Say, are you doing anything special as we in the next few weeks? Right? Be more general, because sometimes people don't celebrate whatever holiday you celebrate. And another thing to think about is, what do you have as your representation of yourself, and how do you ask questions of others? Now, if you know that someone celebrates a specific holiday, asking them what they're doing for that holiday is absolutely appropriate, and it actually shows that you know them and that you respect them enough to remember that. But if you're in an environment where you don't know everyone, be more broad with your questions. And then again, if someone celebrates something that you're not familiar with, don't just say, oh, okay, cool. Ask questions like, huh, you know, I hear a lot about Hanukkah. Is that like the Jewish Christmas? And even that question is really not the best way to ask it, but we hear that so much, right? So one of the things I find a little comical is people will say, oh, well, Hanukkah is the Jewish Christmas and Kwanzaa is the Black Christmas. And I'll be like, actually, no. Kwanzaa has no root in religion at all. It's a cultural celebration that was actually created by someone here in the States. So there's so many things that are misnomers out there. And Hanukkah is celebrated around the same time of year as Christmas. And yes, it's Jewish, but it's not the most religious holiday. It's not like, you know, and I think those are some of those misnomers that people think that they're being really open when they're talking about different religions or different observances. They think that, oh, I get it. I get it. I'm going to talk about it. I'm so cool because I'm talking about it. Or the word I hate, right? I'm woke because I'm talking about it. But it's about acknowledging what is actually correct, asking questions, leaning in with curiosity, and then owning when you're not right. Like, you know what? I honestly thought this was this. Thank you so much for clarifying, right? And I think that's a big thing, is when you're trying to lean in with respect, you have to have curiosity and also asking for permission to be curious. Like, you know what? I've never met someone who celebrates that holiday. Can I ask you a few questions? I'm just really curious. Or even saying, I know I can Google this, but I'd rather get it from someone who celebrates it directly. Would you be open to answering some questions? And I think that's really important. It's also really important for us to look at the federal holiday schedule. What's really interesting in the US is their federal holidays, and about half of them are centered around Christian holidays. That's really, really interesting. And, we're talking mostly about education, but in corporate America, this is something we work with them as well about, is having floating holidays and things like that. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about that, but Justin, how does the concept of secularism in the US public ed system, because we've talked a lot about US public ed, how does that contrast with the reality of religious influences? And do you see any gaps or differences between what we experience here in the US and what you experience in the Philippines?
Yeah, so secularism in the US public education is intended to ensure neutrality, creating an inclusive space for different faiths, and uh, where students of all beliefs are treated equally. But in practice, religious influences often manifest through gaps in policy, like you mentioned. For example, Christian holidays like Christmas, Easter are more widely celebrated, and while other religious holidays are overlooked, and a lot of the breaks are scheduled around those Christian holidays. And I'd say in the Philippines, that would be the case as well, whether it's, you talked about the difference of public and private schools. You wouldn't, whether you go to a non-secular public school or a religious private school, you won't really notice much of a difference because of how deeply ingrained in the culture religion is, even in public schools. Like, I think more so in public schools. For example, while driving on the road, see public schools now that are already decorated for Christmas. Often they hold competitions for best decoration or things like that. So sometimes curriculum may also reflect biases in the U.S. education space. Also, where we are, where history and literature courses are often centered in Judeo-Christian perspectives.
Yeah. And
So,
what's really interesting with that is, we talk about the holidays and we talk about door decorating contest. I know for myself, when I was teaching, we had door decorating contest, right? We had to decorate our door for different times of the year. And I remember around like in December when we did our door decorating contest, so many people did Christmas trees or like the chimney for Santa to come down. And I remember as a young educator being like, I'm going to do something different. So I always did like some kind of an animal, right? And I based it off of a book. So one time I did, it's a movie too, but Happy Feet, right? The movie Happy Feet, there was a penguin book called Happy Feet, and I did a penguin. And there was actually a flip part. So you could flip the daddy's belly and see the baby penguin underneath, right? But I remember trying to be very conscious of not doing a specific religion, not doing a specific like celebration. Instead, it was because it's not just about religious celebrations either, right? We have other observances and celebrations that are rooted in other pieces, like the 4th of July, rooted in ethnocentrism. And there's so many different pieces that we just have to look at the whole picture. But when we're looking at that, especially in our public education, that comes into it.
yeah, so how do legal frameworks surrounding the First Amendment influence the teaching of religion in public schools?
The First Amendment is something that we talk a lot about, right? Freedom of speech. And when we talk about that, I think it comes up not just with religion. Everyone has the right to freedom of speech. And at the same time, especially in our school systems, we need to ensure that everyone is safe, that everyone is able to express their authentic selves without putting down someone else. And that's the key piece, right? Is yes, you have the right to freedom of speech. And that freedom of speech cannot diminish the right to someone else to a prosperous life. And it's not just around religion, it's around everything. Hate speech, okay, well, you have the freedom of speech. But if it's hate speech and it's diminishing or hurting someone else, then that's not okay. And I think that's what we need to look at when we're talking about the First Amendment, period, whether it's around religion, whether it's around hate speech, whatever it is. We need to be really mindful that your right to freedom of speech does not supersede someone else's right to live their life. And that's what we need to look at. So, yes, people can share their First Amendment, they can share whatever they feel is necessary to share. The other thing that I tell people quite often is whether you're in a school system or in corporate, if you are accepting a paycheck to work for a specific company or agency, then you need to acknowledge and respect whatever values and beliefs that system stands for. And I recognize that that is a privilege of sorts, because if you don't have the ability or the luxury to go find a different job, I hear that. However, when you accept a paycheck, for example, from a school system, if their school system values and beliefs are that we're going to be all inclusive of different religions, then you as an individual, when you are in those school rooms, those classrooms, you need to honor and accept all religious beliefs, because that is where you work, right? You can still have your personal beliefs and value system when you step outside of those doors. On the weekends and the evenings, you can still be you. No one's asking you to change your personal beliefs. But when you're in those doors, you must adhere to the values and beliefs of the company that you work for or the school system you work for. And I think that's something that we talk about a lot. And it's really important, especially as we come into a new era and with President Trump coming back into office, we really need to look at that.
It's been such a meaningful conversation, and we've spent a lot of time talking today. So, as a closing thought, Megan, what actionable steps can educators, parents, and policymakers take to promote religious neutrality and respect for diverse worldviews in schools?
The number one thing I'm going to ask everyone to do is to take a look at what they talk about and what they don't talk about and create a running list, and at least have acknowledgement of what is talked about in our schools. Again, not to persuade someone to be a specific religion or to observe a specific holiday, but simply to help students understand what those holidays stand for and why they came to be. I think that is number one. Look at your policies, look at what you are reciting in your classrooms, look at how those conversations take place. A lot of schools have their own mantras or their own pledges. Take a look at that. Is there a reference to God? Is there reference to a specific belief system? If you are in a public school, there should not be reference to any of that. And how can we adjust some of that? So just really having that critical lens to look at everything that's implemented in our school systems right now.
Thank you, Megan. And as always, thank you so much for bringing such valuable insight and energy to the discussion. And for everyone tuning in, thank you so much. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions or anything that you want us to discuss, leave a comment, leave a review, or email us at info@us2consulting.com. And that's all for us for today.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. And also, really quickly, we do have a new series coming out, the Us Squared Changemakers Meet the Team. I'll be interviewing members of our team on a monthly basis to just kind of share a little bit of their awesomeness with the rest of the world. So excited to have all of you continue to share the message. Remember that we must be the change that we need in the world today. If not you, then who? And if not now, then when? Have a great day, everyone.